Hello.
Testing,
Had-
testing, testing. Oh no. Testing, testing. Hello, hello. Hey, I see you, Harry. Mine's on. It's on. It's on. Hello, hello, hello. Testing.
We're gonna do it this way
The publisher will. Will you be back in a week or two?
because this is
Yes.
also going to be recorded, so you can, yeah.
Yeah. So if you snap that QR code, you can buy it now, and I'll bring it in a week or two when it's arrived. Yeah.
Yours is on?
This is also. Oh, hey.
It's not on. Oh, here. Hello. Great. If you want to grab your last snack and join us up in the front, we're gonna get started with our book talk. Thank you so much. We're gonna get started imminently. Yeah, he was. Yeah, I didn't even know who he was. I literally, this sounds like an interesting talk.
Yeah, he's crazy.
And then he's so like confident. He's so great. He's just this quirky old man now, and he's just like, yeah, I've been teaching since I was 10. And
And I think he might be right. I mean,
oh no, he's like, he's using mathematical models.
yeah.
And I think part of the resonance is like, he is, yeah, he's just like looking at the charts and he's like, oh, this is what's gonna happen. He's been right up to now, so I had just no idea. Total cult following.
Yeah, I know. I'm working on a project with a guy who is like the is like a huge Kurzweil fan,
Yeah.
and has spent like look at these footnotes for the guy.
You might learn a thing or two.
I think I might. Yeah.
Go on ahead and grab that last cup of coffee and your special edition bookie for the book talk. And please join us in the front. We're going to start very shortly. Oh, thank you.
Oh yeah. Thank you.
See, I told you, get ready.
I know. I know. Oh wow. It got quiet.
Yeah, it did. It's that 7-minute lull.
Yeah. Yeah. You got to capitalize on it.
Great. Thank you so much. If everyone wants to make their way up to the front, and we're going to get started.
Got such a great public speaking voice. Library vibes.
Yeah, also, sit down.
I told you to do reading magic.
Use your right arm. Can I just say a word about
Oh sure. Do you
focusing
want me to do
towards the
that?
end or like the front
Towards the
beginning?
end, yeah.
Okay,
If they
okay,
want the
yeah,
book
because I don't,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
that
don't
part
want
I
to
don't know
assume.
anything
Yeah.
about.
Okay. I'll feel it.
All right. So we do have a little bit of a tight turnaround, so that we're just gonna go ahead and get started. First of all, let's just like start it off with a warm round of applause for Michael and the launch of his lived theology of everyday life. Hopefully, you got a special edition cookie. We've been talking about this for a long time, so glad that we made it happen. We're going to do kind of a quick Q&A at the end, so please start preparing now. I know it always throws people off when they're like, oh my gosh, questions. So I have a few questions I've prepared, and then we'll turn it over to you. So please don't be shy and glean what you can, but also you can be out of pocket, right?
Yeah. Totally fine.
So I have the honor of, moderating this book talk today, and I was just so jazzed to hear that Michael was writing this book because if you haven't had a chance to go to any of his classes, whatever the topic is, I'll just go. It just blows me away every time in terms of the way that you're able to fuse just theology, faith, and our everyday life. I still tell people about your class about the subversiveness of the gospel.
Wow, thank you.
It really like changed so much of my thinking. So I'm going to read your official biography because there are some really wonderful things that people may not know about you.
All right.
So, Reverend Dr. Michael DeLashmutt is Senior Vice President and Dean of Chapel at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church in New York City, where he's also a professor of theology. He's a constructive Anglican theologian whose research explores the intersections of creation, culture, and technology. His work addresses how theology, technology, and culture intersect in shaping human identity and embodied practice, recovering a sacramental and participatory account of divine creativity in the ordinary and the technological alike. How's that for a mouthful? With his wife, Julia, he is co-founder of Potter and the Priest Studio, a nonprofit ceramic studio which offers courses and retreats on the spirituality of making. They live on the Close at Chelsea Square. I didn't know that was an address. I like that. In New York, of the General, which is General Seminary's historic home for over 200 years. So let's welcome him again with an applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it works sometimes. Is this working? Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I have to get really close.
You have to get
Yeah.
very close. Okay, great. So I had asked, since not everyone has had the pleasure of reading the book yet, perhaps if you could open us with a short excerpt,
Sure.
just to give people kind of a little taste. Do you want to share maybe the excerpt that you want to share, or the?
Yeah,
Is it
which
the
one?
Okay, well, maybe we'll go with, I really loved on page 38 and 39, he has a little 3 paragraphs on why I study popular culture,
Okay.
which I thought kind of embodied a lot of what I love about this book. So I'll have him read that.
Okay. So, why I study popular culture. Like many people who work in this field, my interest in theology and popular culture began as a way of bringing together two seemingly divergent parts of my life. My involvement as a participant in or consumer of popular culture, and my growing interest in a critical and creative reflection on my Christian faith, which took the form of an interest in Christian theology. For me, the process of making sense of theology and popular culture was not straightforward. The church tradition that I was part of during my early 20s was remarkably conservative. As inheritors of the American holiness Pentecostal tradition, we didn't drink or smoke, and we shied away from the cinema unless it was PG rated or below, and we listened exclusively to Christian contemporary music. There was a body for us joke that was frequently told about people who went to my conservative Christian university. It was said that our college campus didn't allow premarital sex because sex could lead to dancing. Thank you for laughing at that. If a cultural form or practice was secular, we avoided it like a spiritual plague. In the mid-1990s, I was a pastor at a small non-denominational charismatic church near Seattle. It was the evening of the 4th of July, and my wife and I were at a barbecue at the house of a parishioner. The parishioner's small bungalow had an exceptional view of our town's harbor, where later that evening the annual fireworks display would begin. The mood was light and cheery, and in addition to the sounds of the bonfire crackling in the background and children running around playing, a nearby radio was tuned to a local pop music station on which Joan Osborne's One of Us was softly but recognizably playing. In light of our avoidance of all things secular, it was unusual to hear a mainstream song playing on a mainstream radio station at a social gathering of our church friends, though of course the fact that I could recognize this pop song shows that my strict devotion to this form of cultural conservatism was already fraying at the edges. As I listened to the lyrics of this unremarkable pop song, lyrics, by the way, that I couldn't actually post in the book without getting Joan Osborne's permission, and I thought it wasn't worth it. So something in me switched on. I was amazed to hear that such a theologically important question about the nature of God's relationship to humanity was being discussed with such honesty and directness in the context of all places, secular music. I found Osborne's lyrics to be a compelling indictment of the contemporary Christian culture I was so uncritically consuming at the time. In Osborne, I found someone from outside of the church who was asking the kind of deep questions about the nature of God's relationship to the world in her trite pop music that I would have expected, though frequently didn't find, in the trite songs broadcast on the local Christian radio station. It shocked me that out there in the world, one could find matters relating to God being discussed in deeper, messier, and perhaps more authentic ways than what I could frequently find in the Christian cultural ghetto within which my church and I were situated.
Thank you for that. So I love that passage so much because I think it kind of just leads into what you write about in your introduction. So even like from the introduction, I got most of my questions. That's how pithy this book is. But you do such a lovely job about talking about your journey into writing this book. And I was wondering if you'd share with the audience a little bit of your faith journey, your relationship, and maybe sometimes estrangement even with the church, and how it led to the writing of this very relevant book.
Well, yeah, thank you. So I teach my students often that theology is like 85% biography, and because like the texts and the stories that make up our faith are usually stories about people who have had an encounter with God that changes their lives in some meaningful way, and they spend the rest of their life trying to figure out what that means and how they situate themselves within that. I mean, it's everything from the stories or myths or whatever in Scripture to like Augustine's Confessions in the 4th and 5th century, where we find people just trying to make sense of this life and how we can find meaning in this life in light of our relationship with God. And yeah, I've been in church my whole life. And some of my earliest memories are church related. I mean, I loved as a kid, like rolling around under the pews, literally, rolling around collecting dust bunnies at the old Baptist church that my mom would drag me to. And I had really fond memories of VBS and all of this. But at some point, my faith started to kind of fray as I guess I recognized that the person that I was no longer the person that I had been formed to be, and the kinds of questions that I was asking about God and myself and the world around me no longer seemed to be answerable by the kinds of tools and resources that I was given growing up. And it led me on a very circuitous route to becoming an Episcopal priest kind of later in life. But along the way, I spent time with Pentecostals and Presbyterians and Lutherans and non-denominational Christians and the Episcopal Church in Scotland and the Church of England and eventually the Episcopal Church. And along that way, I learned different grammars and different languages and different practices for trying to make sense of the life of faith and recognizing eventually that there are points of grace where I can see God at work in various parts of the story. Some of them are a little embarrassing to tell, and some of them are really helpful in me trying to make sense of my faith today.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the title of your book is A Lived Theology of Everyday Life, which I think we can get on board with. We understand the words, but you use this phrase in your, a phrase, portmanteau, if you will, the concept of life world,
Yeah.
one word,
Yeah.
which is such a lovely concept. And I was wondering if you could expand on what that means in light of your work.
Yeah, so it's a technical philosophical word that's drawn from phenomenology, a particular branch of philosophy, and it's often identified with the work of the 20th century philosopher Edmund Husserl. And what it means by life world is effectively the whole of the world of experience. And it's the broadest possible way of thinking about the water that I swim in or the world that I inhabit, that includes all of the things that I see or maybe don't see that have impact in shaping my experience of and the meaning that I derive from the world. So it's everything from my social interactions, my participation within economic systems or political systems, the material culture that I contribute to and consume and make meaning with, my religious or theological worldviews, what it means to be a parent or a son or a child or a friend. All of these things gathered together make up my experience of this life world. And it was, the broadest concept that I could think of to capture that kind of feeling of everyday life. And, a French word for this is quotidien, right? And we could talk about the kind of the quotidian or the everyday, and that's, the Latin version of the Lord's Prayer calls for, give us this day our quotidian bread, our daily bread. And I wanted something that could convey something other than the secular, I guess, because the secular feels like a space that God is not, though I think that's problematic to even conceive of something like that. But the life world or the quotidian or the everyday, it looks at the whole of the thing and asks, how might I encounter God within the whole of that thing? Because our lives are really complicated, and I think it's and also in ways that are unhelpful, but also almost irresistible, fragmented, where the person that I might see myself being right now on this stage may not be the person that I imagine myself being at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon or evening. And so to try to seek wholeness, not in a way that homogenizes the various elements of my life, but in a way that recognizes the different pieces are part of a whole, kind of like a stained glass window.
Speaking of stained glass window, you have this beautiful chapter. If you haven't had a chance to visit Potter in the Priest Studio, by the way, I've had the privilege of taking part in this, but there's a line you have kind of midway into the book. It says, making is not merely a metaphor for theological reflection, but a means of encountering God. And I think it perfectly encompasses kind of what you're just talking about, infusing God, thought, thinking about God into everyday practice. So you introduce readers to the world of pottery, which, like, from the evangelical standpoint, I'm like, yeah, we'll see how this goes, because there's so many, like, allusions, right, to pottery. But it led you to kind of creating this Fabricanda Divina, which is a practice-based spirituality of making. And so I've gotten to partake in this liturgy before, but could you tell the audience what it is and then kind of what it means to you?
Yeah, so I think the reason that we were drawn to even thinking about developing something like this is, having grown up and been formed evangelical Pentecostal in my teens and early 20s, so much of like the spirituality that is like that baseline spirituality. I think that our religious identities, like so many of our identities, are a bit like the kind of like sedimentary strata that you see on like a riverbank, where there's like different colors of deposits that are resting on top of each other. And that fundamental one is you can either spend your life ignoring it or trying to cover it up, or recognize that there's something to be reckoned with there. And so the kind of fundamental spirituality that is the kind of default brainstem mode is one that's very disembodied. In fact, maybe God is a little angry that he gave me a body, because it seems like the sins that I want to do the most are the ones that have to do specifically with the body. And so I'm trying to recover embodiment as like a spiritual practice, but also a site of incredible grace, that God chose to make the world as it is out of material things. And primarily the story of Scripture is God doing stuff with material things through the people that God makes, whether that's, the stories of the Bible or the incarnation of Jesus, or even the process by which the Bible came to be, is a very materially involved, human engaged process that God is with. So we were thinking about how might pottery, how might ceramics help to reinforce the importance of embodiment. But really, even more, that's at the kind of theoretical level. At the practical level, for 3 years I was for 2 years I was the president of the seminary, and it was a job that nearly killed me, because I had to wrestle some really difficult problems with a 200-year-old institution that didn't really want to be fixed. And it left me exhausted, broken, depleted, and I was blessed by my trustees with a sabbatical at the end of it. And I had all these hopes for writing, this book or that book, none of which is this one or the other ones that I'm working on now, but there you go. Instead, I spent 6 months hunched over a pottery wheel. And I could finally have some of the voices that are in my head quiet down. And I could begin to learn to be a little bit more forgiving with myself, because the clay is, pottery's hard to learn how to do well. except for Julia, who's naturally able to do everything well, which is infuriating when you have a wheel next to hers. But for the rest of us, it's hard to learn to do well, but it's also extraordinarily forgiving. And it requires a great deal of presence and attentiveness. For me, it invites me into a kind of, what we used to call a flow state, where, again, it feels like those voices begin to quiet down in the mind. And I found it such a deeply healing experience. I began to wonder if there are lessons in this that one might be able to teach in 30 minutes as opposed to 30 weeks. And so that's the kind of practical side of the pottery practice.
Could you maybe like walk us through what it would be like? Because I don't know that you could know it until you do it. Like,
Yeah.
I'm like, oh yeah, that like exactly describes it, but it is
Yeah.
unique.
So we come into the studio, and usually, we begin with some social time, a little pizza, a little beer, or beverage of choice, and then when we clear the paper plates and greasy napkins away, we invite everyone to sit around work tables where a slab of clay has been placed in front of everyone and a few rudimentary tools. And we begin with a liturgy that actually Stephanie introduced me to from Everyday Holy, where we invite God to be present in a creative practice, and also invite God to deliver us from the sin of perfectionism, which is very much at that deliverance from perfectionism is very much at the heart of this thing. And then we, recognize where clay comes from and how it's this elemental material that's a process of hundreds of thousands of years of erosion and geological forces, how it becomes a metaphor for ourselves in Scripture so often, and what it means for us to participate in the creative process that takes a natural substance like clay and then offers it up to the fire for transformation, and what that transformation might tell us about ourselves. And then through a process of prayer and reading and reflection and making, the end result is that students will walk away with a hand cross or some other kind of clay object that will then fire and final fire for them that they can take away. The hope is that this artifact that they create can remind them of their connection to the earth. From dust we came, to dust we shall return, and remind them of God's presence in something as simple as everyday making.
I love that. We are jumping around a little bit, so sorry if it feels a little like I gave Christine like 12 questions, and she's like, we don't have time for that. So we're going to kind of shift gears. That's why I'm saying that. So later on in the book, you make this profound argument about church, saying that the church can be a source of systemic change through investment, education, and advocacy. And it makes so much sense. And my question was like, why do you think we don't see church often typified in this way? And why does it seem like this is the exception, not the role, like the rule of the role of the church?
Well, that's a super complicated question that I think, splits the church in its ideal form of what maybe it could be, maybe what God would like the people of God to be, and what the church ends up being in reality, in the same way that maybe God has an ideal purpose for humanity that we often don't live up to. I think the church is a community formed by this incredibly radical gospel of love, and which places love and empathy and identification with the other at its very heart, that should allow us to hold differences in tension, differences in terms of socioeconomic status or what have you, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. All of this should be able to be held within this kind of beautiful tension, but yet we are so that call to empathetic love is so difficult for us to live out that we are almost always failing at it in some way or the other. And so if the church were to truly love the other and to imagine what it's like to be in the place of the other, in the way that the incarnation of Christ speaks to, of the timeless God taking on temporality, taking on materiality, this grand paradox. It's the grand mystery that's at the center of our faith, where God so identifies with the world that God sends God's Son. If we were to become a community like that, what would it look like for us to identify with those who are suffering and with those who are succeeding, to identify with those who are in pain and those who are experiencing stability? Because that kind of radical expansiveness is really at the heart of the gospel. When we think about the people that Jesus and his early followers were ministering to and among, it did represent such a radically diverse scope of the society that they were in. If the church were to manage that, which in a way I think St. Peter's has uniquely, in my experience, been able to do, then we can begin to subvert so much of what is death dealing as opposed to life affirming in this world.
So you do kind of like delve into a lot of elements of your life. Like there is a whole chapter on like being a dean.
Yeah.
I'm not going to specifically, I kind of tailor questions more for our congregation, but like just to that element, I thought you briefly mentioned St. Peter's. Maybe we could broaden the scope a little bit, but you have this commentary on culture and how it surrounds us completely in that way of like, does a fish know it's wet, right? And I know it's impossible to generalize for all New Yorkers, but was wondering if you could venture into like what you envision. What is the culture that we live in that we're like maybe not aware of it? Like the too long didn't read is like, what do you typify as New Yorker culture, or things that maybe we need to be aware of as we're like, we just accept these things as, yeah, this is what we are and this is how everybody is, but like, yeah, it's unique to us.
Well, I think that's both a really difficult and in some ways there are ready examples to cite. So the difficulty is it really strikes to the core of being a New Yorker, which is probably why that is the difficulty, because I think we assume, and I would say rightly, that we're the center of the universe. You know, it's the greatest city in the world.
We actually are, though.
Yeah.
No.
And so, and when you begin to realize that that's not how the rest of the world sees us, that's really threatening and destabilizing. What do you mean that this isn't the greatest place and that our politics aren't the best, or that there is actually a singular politic? I mean, I don't know if any of you have been to Staten Island, but it's not Manhattan, even though it's an island. And that's the kind of thing that we forget about, is that the dominant narrative that we hear in our minds and we hear kind of echoed back to us from, as particularly in a algorithmically driven media culture, where I can, even without me giving any kind of overt permission to, can have my entire media consumption curated based on my preferences. When we stop hearing differences, then we forget that those differences exist. And so that's why when we hear political opinions that are different from our own, they can just be so shocking. And we might say, how in the world could anyone believe this way? But what we don't realize is underneath those beliefs are entirely different ways of inhabiting the world, wherein while we might sort of occupy the same planet, we occupy different experiences of that planet, country, whatever, based on our own kind of unique corner of the life world, to go back to that kind of first comment. So I think for us, the culture that we probably need to be mindful of the most of is our often our latent, if not sometimes overt, superiority as New Yorkers, and recognizing that there are different ways of seeing the world out there. That would, I'd say, would be our culture.
This is an audience warning. This is going to be my last question. So feel free, like we had the class, ask me anything, ask a theologian like Michael can literally answer any question. So don't feel like, oh, I didn't read the book, I don't have a question.
I have
like
very specific disciplines that I can do that too. So
He's very good at it.
Nothing sciencey.
So please start preparing.
Or sports. No sports.
And also save him, because I do have a bonus question which
I'm not gonna
involves
sing
like
that.
singing songs,
No.
and yeah, this is the one thing he does not
I do not like to do. Yeah.
So my closing question is, you close with this line, "Theology must meet us where we are," and I was wondering if you could kind of, as a closing statement to us here as individuals, what does that mean for us as individuals, and then us here as a church, as St. Peter's Chelsea, what does it mean that theology must meet us where we are?
Yeah. I think that there is a tendency to think that theology is something that priests or professors are the only ones that need to care about. And, uh, and I suppose if I could maybe do one thing in my, the vocation that God has called me to, would be to try to pique a kind of curiosity about how theology can speak to all of us. Because I think theology is more than just learning historical systems or learning the history of knowledge. But what theology ultimately is God inviting us to love God with our minds. And there's nothing wrong with loving God with our minds in such a way that we can see the patterns and the connections between things, that we can begin to see how what we might say or pray or do on a Sunday could relate to our experience with the rest of the world. And I suppose one of my I don't know if it's the right way to look at things, but for me, I really love kind of when theology feels coherent, like what I say about God makes a difference to how I want to treat my neighbor, for example. And um, and I sometimes talk about it as like intellectual chiropractic, getting everything aligned in the right way so that the energy can flow in the right directions. And so I would hope that that people who read this book, or in general people of faith who don't read this book, because there'll be certainly more of them than there are of the latter, will find in theology a way of making their faith come alive across all the parts of their life. Whether it's in like the chapters of the book, whether it's work or play or making or a really niche career that you might find yourself falling into, there isn't a part of your life where God isn't present, or where thinking about God might not help illuminate something about what you're doing.
Yeah. We'll take questions from the audience. I'm going to actually pass you the mic because we are live streaming this. So if you have a question, just slip up your hand. One thing a final thing I wanted to say about this book is I think when you go into the Christian or the self-help section of a bookstore, you're like, oh, yeah, okay, there's a lot of books that are like, this is praxis. This is how you live your life as a
Especially
Christian.
ones with ice cream cones on the cover.
But what I really loved about this was like, it was really like just intellectually engaged. I mean, it really does feel like you're kind of holding a little piece of Michael DeLashmutt. Like this is like you've gotten a piece of your brain in here. But it is really like from an intellectual standpoint, a theological standpoint. I loved being able to like think through these things where it wasn't so much about like, oh, if I do this now I'm living like a Christian.
Right.
It was much less praxis focused and much more like, why are we doing the things we do?
Thank you.
So yeah, I wanted to offer that. Do we have any questions from the audience? Great.
Michael, you were saying earlier that theology is mostly biography.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you've put a large part of your own biography into the book. And I was curious if that was difficult and how you came to the decision to do that. Because I think it could be a totally intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how you made that decision.
Yeah. I hated it. I hated putting myself in the book. I was formed as an academic to never use a first-person pronoun, to never put myself in my writing, to treat my subject as if it's not really a subject, but really an object, like something that I can scientifically, as it were, scrutinize and interrogate and tell the 7 different views on, but leave it up to you to figure out which one that actually you believe in or resonates with you. And I find that just so boring to read as a reader, and I find it so disconnected from my own life, and so it really, part of it was, I think, wanting to be able to tell a story of faith that my own children could maybe relate to someday, when I'm gone and they find a dusty box of 50 of these books somewhere in the attic, and they're like, I wonder what Dad thought about this. But because I think that the church often ignores that your story really matters to God. And wouldn't it be great if we could learn a habit of how we could weave our own story into the God story, and to begin to see ourselves not just as sort of autonomous folks bouncing around in a room, but people who have been, as the Bible talks about, grafted into this tradition or adopted into this family of God. What does it mean when you're adopted? It means multiple stories of families are now kind of bound together in this new thing that's going on. Not where your old story has been erased, but your story is now brought alongside these other stories. So how might we learn from ourselves? How might we learn to see God in our own way of telling our own story? But very practically, I was sitting down with a friend of mine who's an author, and actually I gave her a first draft of this book. And she's like, it's interesting, but it's a little dry. You've got a couple of stories about yourself that you throw in there. Why don't you try to do that more often? And so I did, and I found it really helpful. And so in everything I've been writing the last year and a half, I've tried to ground it in some bit of autobiography. The inner critic, and those of you who know me know that I have a very loud inner critic that's like right here all the time. Maybe it's like the devil angel thing, but instead of the devil telling me to like eat donuts, it's the inner critic saying other things. It complains that oh, this is self-aggrandizement. Nobody wants to know about you. You're just kind of boasting. Most of these stories are not very boastful at all, so that kind of counters that one. But I think that while there's a risk of bringing so much of myself into this work, I think ultimately, for the sake of making theology find a home in all of our lives, I think it's been worth it.
I was going to add for the, to that author's credit, like those are the parts of the book I love the most. I was like, ooh, another Michael story. And so they actually, yeah.
Story time with Father
yes.
Michael.
Any other questions?
Michael, I think we would agree that you identify as a Christian theologian.
Yes.
Good. Didn't want to be off on that one. I could be serious. How has that impacted the writing of this particular book?
Well, it's forced me to really figure out what kind of theologian I am, I guess. And that's a hard thing because there are like 1,000 different subdisciplines of theology that one could be. And so I situate myself as a constructive theologian, which is a little bit like a theological magpie. So I see shiny things and I bring them into the nest and I try to sort of make sense. You know what? You've taken enough classes from me that you kind of know that that's how my weird mind works. So I want to bring as many dialogue partners into conversation as I possibly can. As a Christian constructive theologian, or as an Anglican Christian constructive theologian, I do see this work as being uniquely grounded in God's self-disclosure of who God is through the person of Jesus Christ, through the incarnation, the whole enchilada, the birth, the death, the ascension, and the continuation of Christ's presence in the world by the Spirit in the church. And as an Anglican theologian, I give a particular privilege to this tradition and the way that our forebears have thought about questions of faith and salvation and meaning and purpose and destiny, who are somewhere between Catholic and Reformed or Orthodox or what have you, and are trying to make sense of all of this within that kind of milieu.
Did you have an editor? And if so, what was their role in the formation of this book?
So this book did not have a very engaged editor. The next one does, so this was very much my own thing. And I didn't sit down and hash it out in one go. The essays the chapters had their first iteration as either essays or papers that I gave at conferences and presentations, or things that I had been working on that I never really wanted to publish. I really don't like people reading things that I write, and so which is probably not a good thing to do when you're writing a book. So don't buy this. Or if you do buy it, don't read it. That's actually the better one. So buy it, don't read it. And so I had this just like huge volume of stuff that I hadn't gotten around to sharing, and so it seemed like it was finally time for things to make their way to the public. Yeah.
Looks.
Oh, no sports, Harry. No sports. No sports questions.
It's okay, I already forgot my question.
I don't know anything about the Ravens.
When I think of theology, I also think of your brain. It's like the Library of Congress and thousands of years of history. And thank goodness there's people like you with your personal anecdotes and the ability to break it down into English. For folks like me who just otherwise see this just wall of history and information, it's so intimidating. I don't want to engage. So
Thank you.
props to you.
Thank you.
I did buy your book.
Thank you.
I haven't read it.
Oh no. Oh no. Yeah, I mean that's the funny thing, right? Is that you become the kind of person that gets entered into this canon of sources, of all the 2,000 years or the 3,000 years of intellectual history that precedes us where we are, and we just imagine all of them are like tweed jackets with leather arm patch, pipe smoking, kind of Tolkien-esque people that have no fun and no story and never curse. And the reality is that they're not at all that way. I mean, there are some nerds, but there are a lot of really fascinating people that had very complicated lives, and we get like a snippet of that. And I suppose what I'm trying to do is, instead of just getting the kind of the top bit, the brain bit of a person, really inviting us to see the kind of the whole of a person and how that story impacts what we think. So if there aren't any other questions, I will illustrate how to purchase but not read the book. So if you're interested in purchasing it, there is a box of them on the way that didn't arrive in time. So I encourage you to snap this QR code, and that goes to my website, which I hate admitting that I have now. And you can purchase a copy there, and I will bring it to St. Peter's. And if you want it signed, you can indicate that you'd like it signed or a dedication. And it's I'm selling them for $20. I think Amazon has them for $25 right now until they start going into the pulping zone and start going down to like $5. So you can always wait and when they're in the bargain basement, but don't. But if you don't want to purchase this way, you can also Venmo me $20, and I'll similarly bring a book. But it's a little easier to keep track of things here.
I was wondering if you could grace us with one last passage, because it felt very much to me like a benediction.
Okay.
On page 156, you have the implications for practice, which sometimes is like, oh, that's when I get to take notes in the sermon.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if you could just read that section there, because you kind of have 3 charges
Yeah.
for your readers,
Sure.
and I thought that'd be a good way to close.
So as we bring this journey to a close, it is worth considering how these reflections might shape the way we live. First, this book invites us to cultivate attentiveness. The God we seek is often found in the interruptions, the small moments, and the spaces we might otherwise overlook. Attentiveness is a spiritual practice, one that opens our eyes to the ways God is at work in and through the world around us. Second, it challenges us to embrace humility. A lived theology of everyday life recognizes that we do not have all the answers. Instead, we approach the world with a posture of curiosity and wonder, open to being surprised by grace. This humility also compels us to listen deeply to the voices of others, to the needs of creation, and to the Spirit's quiet guidance. Finally, it calls us to action. Theology is not simply about understanding, it is about transformation. Whether it is through acts of justice, practices of care, or the creative expressions of our gifts, theology invites us to participate in God's redemptive work in the world. This participation is not limited to grand gestures, but is woven into the fabric of everyday decisions and relationships.
Thank you so much for that. Let's give another round of applause. Congratulations. Thank you for coming.
You don't even have to buy a book to eat a cookie. But if you'd like to Venmo $20 for the cookie, you can do that too. Thank you so much. Yeah.